Hey, so I want to talk a bit about boxing versus UFC. Um, the general convention is these two sports are in great competition, and there is a tendency, I think, sometimes misplaced, to see the two sports as being enemies of one another. That is to say, if someone's a boxing fan, they have to hate UFC and vice versa. I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. I'll just put my cards onto the table, though I am a boxing fan. That's where my interest lies. And in this video, I want to explain why. But I also want to explain where I feel some of the differences perhaps lie. And I want to make it clear that I'm coming from a point of view that is intended to be respectful, as opposed to, for want of a better term, shit stirring. So once again, this difference is being highlighted with all the hype around Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather Jr., whether they're going to fight or not. As I understand it, Conor McGregor's got a boxing license in California. Um, Now, if he goes ahead and gets a boxing license in Nevada, where Mayweather is based, might happen, but it's to be honest, I think it would be a sideshow. And I'm not saying that to be disrespectful to Conor McGregor. I think he's achieved great things in ultimate fighting, from what I understand. But I think when you get to fundamentally different sports, albeit both martial arts, and you have this sort of event, it will never be taken very seriously. Um, That's not to say that it isn't serious and not to say there isn't risks involved, but it would be a bit like when Muhammad Ali fought that Japanese wrestler in the late 70s. It just is going to be seen as an oddity. It's like if you combine golf and tennis, they're two different sports. Now, the first thing that stands out in my mind with boxing and UFC in terms of difference is history. I guess for other people, that wouldn't necessarily be the first thing that jumps to the mind. For other people, it may be the physical side of it, the fact that with UFC, it's the whole body that's being utilized. With boxing, it's focused on the upper torso. But for me, it's a history factor because I'm something of a historian of boxing. That is to say, I'm interested in the history side of it. Now, boxing goes back to antiquity. There have actually been frescoes found in the Greek island of Crete showing that the Minoans were practicing boxing, even predating classical Greece. So we're going back 3,000 years. There's a famous mosaic dated centuries before the first Olympic Games showing two Minoan youths boxing. So boxing is almost as old as civilization itself. And then the modern sport was revitalized in England in its current context in the 17th century, late 17th century. Of course, that wasn't the same as we know today, but was the foundations of what essentially is modern boxing. And the first recorded modern, in the sense of not being classical, boxing match was in 1684, and it was between a butler and a cook, or various sources differ on this, of the Duke of Albemarle um, in England in 1684. Very few details available on that, but it should be noted at this time the standard martial art was not boxing but dueling with swords and cudgeling. Um, the film Rob Roy, which is about the famous Scottish outlaw set at the early 18th century, shows standard practices of the day was dueling. So boxing was starting to be developed at that time, and it was very much an underground sport, and it remained underground, although immensely popular up until the 1850s. Then came in the Marquis of Queensberry rules and so on. Bare knuckle boxing, of course, was very brutal. Bouts often went on for many rounds. The rules were very relaxed. Um, Very often, what happened was prize fighters had very big backers. Usually in England, they had dukes and earls. Even the Prince Regent himself was said to be one of the backers of these sort of prize fights. So they were immensely popular. But when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert came to the throne, they disapproved of it being a blood sport, and then it went underground. So the sport had to kind of then regulate itself, which I suppose is the history of all martial arts. The first glove contests, as I understand, were about the 1870s, and then from then on, we know the sport as it is today. Um, Now, that is obviously a long history. So even modern boxing, in the sense that I've just described, over 300 years of history. Um, Being British and being a boxing fan is something that I would also have a certain perspective on. I do consider my country gave birth to the modern sport, so no one can ever point at Britain and say, "Oh, you guys don't know about boxing," or you know, we invented it. We invented the modern sport boxing. So when people want to dismiss British fighters or whatever, I would just remind them of that fact. Um, but not to put too fine a point on it, I believe that boxing has a place in society in a way that mixed martial arts just doesn't. You could say to someone who isn't remotely interested in boxing, name famous boxers, and they probably would. They would probably say Ali or Sugar Ray Robinson or Mike Tyson or Rocky Marciano. And of course, that is partly down to those fighters popularizing the sport. But I believe this sport has had a role in social history in a way that MMA, Ultimate Fighting, doesn't even come close to. If you look at such important events as the civil rights movement in the United States and the role that boxers had in that, in terms of the race role that they played, I mean, from Jack Johnson to Joe Louis to Muhammad Ali, um, if you look at the role boxing has had in popular culture, unless I'm mistaken, there'd probably be more films made about boxing, sports films, than any other sport, whether it be soccer or American football or baseball or anything. Now, that to me indicates that there is an appeal in this sport that is unique. And as a boxing fan, I understand what that is. Um, it's a sport that's very hard to justify to people who just see it as two blokes hitting each other. Although I guess MMA fans would also have challenge explaining. I guess this is true of every martial art, but I do think that boxing has a certain role. I mean, if we look at the film Cinderella Man, that's set during the Great Depression. Obviously, it's a film, but it taps into the sort of social impact that the sport had. In that case, James J. Braddock, how he was seen as fighting for the working man during the Great Depression. During World War II, great fighters like Joe Louis, Ken Overland, and others were used for recruiting for American Marines. So I believe there is an aspect of boxing that really has seeped into the public mind in a way that you just don't get with other martial arts. Now, to be fair, UFC has a much more recent history. It was established between the early and mid 90s. And like many martial arts, it was a combination of various other practices that were ongoing, especially in Brazil, jiu jitsu and so on. And it slowly developed. Of course, in its early days, it's had a lot of stagnation with controversies. Remember, Senator John McCain called it human bear baiting, and there were a lot of people raise eyebrows about the idea of two guys fighting in what essentially was a cage. And I am aware that within mixed martial arts they despise the term cage fighting because I guess it, it's it kind of gives the impression that UFC is today where boxing was in the 1840s, i.e., very brutal and very what the hell are we Roman? Are we Romans all of a sudden? I think Bill O'Reilly said that actually. Um, and the thing is, when you look at certainly the bloody UFC fights, that could certainly be the impression it is given. It does look like a very brutal affair. But the safety record of UFC is fairly good from what I understand, to be fair. Now, as a boxing fan, I cannot deny that this has been a difficult year for boxing in terms of its reputation for safety. But I do honestly believe that no matter what regulation is brought in, all martial arts, all of them are always going to have some safety issues. And UFC cannot claim to be completely innocent in this regard. Earlier this year, there was a young guy died after a bout in Dublin in UFC. So it is not squeaky clean compared to boxing, as it sometimes implies. I think the argument is that there is fewer blows to the head, and it's hard to argue against that. Also, bouts are shorter, and there's a variety of other factors. Um, for me, I do wonder about the aesthetics of it, because if you're looking at two guys fighting in the octagon, the wire mesh surely would have some impact on the aesthetics in terms of viewing the fight. Although I suppose you could argue the same if you're in a big arena, and you're at the back, um, you'd only see it on the big screen or whatever. And then the other issue in boxing is money. Like with football, and by football I'm talking about soccer, football, um, big money has become a big part of it. Now Floyd Mayweather argues that is the appeal of boxing. He credits himself with doing that. Um, I've mixed views on that. On one hand, I sort of understand what he's saying because if you have huge money involved, there is a draw, and it sort of ensures survival. On the other hand, it's not particularly fan friendly. Now Floyd Mayweather has more money than certain African countries have GDPs. He is an immensely wealthy athlete from his stellar career. I mean, Floyd Mayweather is an outstanding fighter. Boxrec currently has the best pound for pound fighter ever. Um, And there's no doubt about it, he is by far the richest fighter ever. He's way surpassed Mike Tyson or Oscar De La Hoya or Sugar Ray Leonard. Um, I don't know if that's good or bad for the sport. Um, I do think there's a problem when, for example, with the Mayweather Pacquiao fight, let's be honest, the only people in that arena were A-list celebrities and the wealthy. Now, I'm not sure if that is a good thing for the sport. Um, I've no problem with celebrities being ringside, and obviously, they're going to pay for better seats. But I do think it would be a problem if the common man doesn't have access to the sport. And pay per view, I understand the rationale behind it. It's a service, you're paying to watch it, just the same as if you go to the cinema, you're paying to watch a film. But I do sometimes wonder, is it too much in that direction? Um, I think a very savvy promoter should maybe consider getting this sport much more accessible to fans who can't necessarily afford pay per view. I mean, I'm a big boxing fan. The only way I can watch fights is on YouTube, usually months later, which is not exactly ideal. Um, so I do wonder, is that an aspect of it? UFC, of course, doesn't generate anywhere near that sort of money. Um, there are the big stars in UFC: Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey. Now, what they're going to do in terms of the capital effect on the sport, I don't know. Um, One thing I would say, boxing isn't going anywhere. There is this idea that, oh, well, UFC is surpassing it and boxing's on a negative downward spiral. Firstly, I don't think you can make sweeping statements. Just because someone has saw a mediocre fight or they've seen a particular fighter that has let them down does not mean the entire sport of boxing is in decline. You can never say that about boxing. You can never say it when there is hundreds, thousands of active professional fighters around. There's always exciting fighters if you just look for them. There's always exciting fights every year. It may not necessarily be the hype fights. And I agree that Mayweather Pacquiao wasn't quite what it was cracked up to be. I personally don't believe it was an awful fight. I don't believe it was extremely boring, as people imply. I just don't think it was as good as a super fight should have been. But I do think that all of these are legitimate questions about what we look at in terms of the future of the sport. But what I would say is, people say, oh, it's a bad time for the heavyweights. Actually, that's starting to change because the Klitschko's are essentially retiring now. Um, I think as Mayweather said, this sport goes well beyond any individual boxing isn't going to go. I'm sure there were many times when it was threatened with being banned or suffered in popularity or whatever. It never went. Also, it's worth noting that there are promoters in the UK, and I think Eddie Hearn deserves some credit for this, who are getting fights on a scale not seen since the days of Jack Dempsey. I mean, when you have 80,000 people at Wembley for the Froch Groves 2 fight, firstly, UFC isn't going to get anywhere near that, but that is more spectators in a football match. I mean, that is the closest modern day equivalent of a gladiatorial game, except there's a consent factor. And for me, that shows the sport is far from decline. Klitschko fights in Germany regularly get 50,000 people. So this idea that the fans aren't going to fights just isn't true. I think Vegas has an issue because that's where big money fights are, and there's this kind of slightly arrogant notion that it is the mecca of boxing. Who says it has to be? London could be the mecca of boxing. Macau could be the new mecca of boxing. You know, Vegas kind of developed that way, but doesn't have to be. Um, you know, nothing is set in stone. And another thing, just regarding the culture issue, I think of, you know, Joe Louis, Max Schmeling, the sort of political influence that had. Again, UFC doesn't come close to that. And I'm not saying that's particularly a good thing. I'm just making the point that the sort of influence that has in history and society. I mean, when Joe Louis won the first Schmeling fight, they said that the celebrations in Harlem were such that it was like 10 4th of Julys, 10 Thanksgivings, and 10 New Year's Eves combined. Um, Credible. So yeah, there's definitely a social aspect to that. Dana White, I think he's a very savvy businessman. I think he's done a lot for his sport. He will be seen as a pioneer, but I don't know that much about him. I don't get a very good impression from what I see. He comes across as quite arrogant and frankly obnoxious. But frankly, so do some boxing promoters. I mean, Don King is hardly a reputable character. Um, and I guess that's an unfortunate side of both martial arts. One thing I would say is I believe personally the best promoters are guys who have been fighters themselves, like Oscar de la Hoya. The reason being is because they can empathize with fighters. Mike Tyson's another example. They're less likely to fuck fighters around. So I think they would make the best promoters. Um, Deep Floyd Mayweather's looking into that. I'm going to round up this video, but basically that's some of my thoughts. If you're a UFC fan, please don't get the wrong idea. I'm not bashing UFC. I'm just explaining why I think those are the differences. Um, and I'm not sort of bashing the courage of UFC fighters either. I believe anyone involved in martial arts, it takes courage. Whether you're getting an octagon or getting a ring, of course it takes courage to fight another man in front of thousands of people. And yeah, there's fewer spectators at UFC fights, but it's still a martial art. So boxing fans should respect those fighters, and MMA fans should respect boxing fight, boxers. It's not a case of one being braver than the other or whatever. Both sports involve risks. Both sports are combat sports. Um, there was that film Warrior with Tom Hardy. I haven't seen it yet, but perhaps there could come a time when UFC starts to really get into the public psyche. But I still think that's a long way to go. But it is still a relatively new sport, so time will tell. Personally, I'm too deeply ingrained in boxing. I've been interested in boxing for too long, I think, to ever really detach from it. But UFC, I won't completely dismiss it. It is what it is. Anyway, that's some of my thoughts on the differences. I'll round this up. Thanks for watching.